I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
I'm Mark Mills. I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and delighted to join Robert, my colleague, and my colleagues from the Manhattan Institute in this, as Robert said, exciting event. And I agree with Robert. This is one of the most exciting times in the United States of America. And when I talk to college students, it's just as a personal side, it deeply offends me that our generation, and I include myself amongst the rough age cohort I see here, have managed to depress so many millennials as to thinking this is a bad time. This is one of the most exciting times to be alive in the history of the world. It's one of the most exciting times to be alive as an American. And the opportunities for young people are astounding, technologically, politically. Yeah, believe me, I'm a Washington, D.C. resident for 32 years. I worked in the White House Science Office a long time ago. I'm intimately familiar with politics and the storm and drunk of the ugliness of it all. But this is the way it's always been. I mean, this is not new. So my son told me last night, he lives here in Manhattan, one of my sons, and he said he looked it up. He's a millennial. There's been 17 government shutdowns, and he started ticking them all off and why they've happened and how they've happened. And then he said, I did something else, because he got a paycheck, and he called me up. He said he was shocked. He started swearing on the phone at me. He said, "They took this much out?" I said, you sound like you're becoming a Republican. This is not good. He works in a very liberal community, so it's not, he has to hide this. He said, I did some math. I calculated how much money the government could get if they taxed 100% of all the income of everybody in the United States, and we'd still run a deficit. I said, you found the formula. It's an exciting time, though, to be young. Let's talk about oil and gas. I have the privilege of taking the slot where I can first introduce my panel and also summarize, put words in the mouth of the previous panel to set the stage for this panel, which we're going to talk primarily about geopolitics, the geopolitical implications of this revolution, this transformation in the United States of America. The reason that the revolution in oil and gas in the United States matters so much, and I include coal like Robert, because as Robert pointed out, we're not just the Middle East or the OPEC of coal. This is the world's largest coal-holding province, the second largest producer, and the lowest cost producer of high-quality coal in the world. And we also export coal. Exports have been on a tear. A lot of exports go to Europe, by the way, and to Germany in particular, where they're building coal plants, which is an interesting irony considering a German's position in promoting solar and wind. And they're building coal plants, by the way, because they're promoting solar and wind. But that's a separate discussion of architectural realities and the physics of electricity you can't avoid. But this is the fact that matters, and why. Let me set the stage and underpin why this discussion matters. 80% of the world's energy is supplied by hydrocarbons. And in 20 years, roughly 80% of the world's energy will be supplied by hydrocarbons. The world's a big place, and it's growing fast. Oil, gas, and coal fuel everything. It's not about some things, it's about everything. And it doesn't matter how fast non-hydrocarbons grow, hydrocarbons will dominate the world for a long time, for the foreseeable future. In fact, the International Energy Agency's most recent forecast for 2 decades, to set the stage, their most optimistic forecast is that even though the world will be dominated by hydrocarbons, to have half of the growth in supply, never mind the existent extraordinarily large base of supply, to have half the growth become non-hydrocarbons, which is their goal, the world will have to collectively spend the next 20 years $6 trillion on subsidies for non-hydrocarbons, to have half of the new supply be non-hydrocarbons and still have 78% of all the supply be hydrocarbons. My bet is the world is not going to spend $6 trillion on subsidies to have an outcome of that kind. That's be my bet, but that's what the forecasts show. So let me let me summarize what I think you heard this morning. It's sort of the big takeaways that are relevant to what we're going to talk about. The first takeaway, I think you would have to agree, is that what's happened in the United States in oil and gas in particular is a technological revolution of the first order. In fact, and as Cal used a language and a word that I've pushed on my oil and gas friends, the United States manufactures oil and gas. This is not an extractive industry. It's an extraordinarily complex manufacturing type of operation. It's technologically centric, and it's highly variable. It's not a cookie-cutter business. It's complex, challenging, U.S.-centric skill set that is driven by not just a static technology change, but an evolving set of technology changes. And we are the epicenter and home progenitor of and driver of these technologies. The second big takeaway is that we have a remarkable infrastructure in the United States, and Robert talked about the pipes and rednecks and that structure. But I would expand the infrastructure definition this way, very broadly, based on what we heard. We do have pipelines, unlike anywhere else in the world. But we also have an infrastructure that I would call the ecosystem of the manufacturing capabilities and the research capabilities and the labor pool. Even though there's a lot of challenges in it, it's still one of the best on the planet. And we have the financial infrastructure, free markets, capital formation. That's unique in the world, the second big takeaway. The third is, as Robert ended at the last session, which most people don't realize, is that the United States is unique in the world in its ownership of mineral rights, which is a political force. Right? You understand this is why this is important. It's not just that it's technologically relevant in that as a business you can now negotiate with a landowner who owns the minerals below because he gets something out of the transaction. He gets a lot out of the transaction. Ohio and Pennsylvania and Texas and Oklahoma and North Dakota have generated thousands and thousands of millionaires in their states. And those millionaires, what do they do? What does an Ohioan do when he becomes a millionaire? Or an Oklahoman? I know these people. They're friends. They're colleagues. They don't spend the money necessarily on a Ferrari or a Tesla. They might. Well, they might buy a Tesla if they want a driving toaster oven. Have you seen the video that's up now of a Tesla on fire, of the kids driving by swearing, oh, shice, when I look at that thing. The battery lit itself on fire, apparently. It's hurt the stock today. They don't do that. They invest in the local community. They invest in local businesses. They invest in their local universities. They invest in their state universities. They love their state. This is they love their communities. And that's exactly what's happening in those states. And it's happening in dozens of states, not one state. Texas, of course, is a big dog, in North Dakota, sort of bracketing the country. This is a potent political force. That land ownership, mineral rights ownership, which will not change, is a potent political force because of who gets wealthy in the heartlands of the country. And the fourth thing I would say about the general architecture of where we are today, which we didn't talk about this morning, and we're not going to talk a lot about today, but it's a pet peeve of mine, but it's relevant to what's changed the architecture of the U.S. system, is that this is a small business revolution. I count Apache as a big small business. I mean, it's a big business, I think 5,000 plus employees. But by big business standards, they're not big oil. This is not a big oil revolution. Almost all of the oil and gas growth in the United States, which has utterly shocked the world, this astounding increase, the world's fastest growing oil and gas producing province is the United States of America, came from small and mid-sized businesses, came from entrepreneurs. The biggest of these businesses are the likes of Apache, but there are thousands of them. If you go into the oil and gas fields of Texas or Oklahoma or North Dakota, what you find is an ecosystem of thousands of businesses, small businesses, truckers, people handling environmental regulations, people handling healthcare. You have manufacturers, you have service companies, and even the E&P companies. There are thousands of small ones. This is a small business revolution. Almost all of the oil and gas increase. In fact, 70% of the employment in oil and gas in the United States, so the direct employment, is in small businesses, not super majors. And all the employment growth has been in small businesses, not in super majors, the Apaches of the world. These are the kind of companies that create this. Now, if you're a foreign country, to bring us to our subject of this panel, if you're an analyst of geopolitics and you look at this, and you have to ask yourself, what is the impact of this revolution on the world stage? Bearing in mind that oil is the largest traded commodity on the planet, period, overwhelmingly so. And is it a permanent shift? Well, I would say from what we heard this morning, I would argue that, and based on my research, that what we do know is this is a permanent secular shift in the structure of world oil and gas markets. It's not a flash in the pan. It's not a bubble. And it's not driven by the government. So if you're a foreign government trying to negotiate and you don't like this, let's say you're Putin and you don't like this happening, for example. You're not negotiating with the President of the United States. The people have driven this. It's not a federal policy. It's not a government policy. What's driven this is the very structure of the United States economy and the entrepreneurship of Americans. This is a very important point, and it means that the shift is structural and permanent and will continue. And it's continued in this way. So let me end with sort of factoids of what this has meant to the United States and what it means to the world. So with oil and gas being the dominant world traded commodities and anchoring everything about the world and will for some time, what we already know is that the United States has become a net exporter of refined petroleum products, as Robert pointed out. In fact, the second largest thing that the United States exports in absolute dollar terms is oil and gas. Oil primarily. Oil, gasoline, by the way, not natural gas. So we're already a net exporter for the first time since 1949. And the total volume of exports is increased by $125 billion annually in the last 5 years alone. We export more refined petroleum products than we do agricultural products. Only things like aviation and transportation products exceed the exports of oil and gas products. The fastest growing exports, oil and gas, and I say by that I mean gasoline, diesel fuels, are in hydrocarbons. This is a big deal. It's still growing. It's growing rapidly. The United States is enjoying about $300 billion added to its GDP. So if you're another country, this is subsidy-free, tax-free. This is generating tax receipts. Nobody's subsidizing it. And all the arguments about subsidies in oil and gas are too cute by half. This is essentially an unsubsidized industry. It's also attracting foreign direct investment. The United States in the last 4 or 5 years has enjoyed an inflow of over $200 billion into the oil and gas fields of America from foreigners wanting to invest in America. And the total CapEx expected to be invested in the American oil and gas infrastructure over the next decade is put by the EIA at $2 trillion, again, unsubsidized. So if you're looking at the infrastructure of the United States as a foreign entity, seeing this structure, and the fact that the United States is not only exporting refined petroleum products, but will now start exporting natural gas, which will it's already upsetting world gas markets, and could export crude oil. But every barrel not imported is just like a barrel exported in terms of the fungibility of oil, and we are the fastest changer in that dynamic on the planet by virtue of being one of the biggest importers. By lowering our imports, it's just like exporting. So against that, if you're looking at the United States as an analyst on the geopolitics and knowing that oil and gas matter, when people say as an invective, we're in the Middle East because of the oil, and it's often said as an invective, the right answer from a high-level perspective is yes. We're there because of the oil. It's because of the fact the world needs oil, not that we can get rid of it. We're not going to get rid of it for a century. And it's because there's so much there and because it's so valuable that it affects geopolitics of the world. We are embroiled in it because of the oil. In fact, it's true. It's not because we want to take their oil. It's because of the oil. So with that, what I'd like each of my panelists to do, and I'm not going to spend time reading their bios. You have their bios. Steve, LeVine, Sandy, Fielden, and Ian, Nathan are all experts. In fact, I would say correctly, much more expert than I am in the sort of dynamics of the geopolitics and how the U.S. affects the world markets. What I'm going to ask each of them to do is address this question, and then they can feel free to elaborate any way they want. Given what I just laid out, that we have changed the game, America has changed the game, unequivocally, on the global stage. In your view, we'll start with Steve and go down, who is the biggest winner or loser? I'm not talking about in the United States, but outside of the United States. Who's the biggest winner or loser because of this radical shift in what America is doing? And why, and what are the implications? So with that, Steve.
Thanks very much, Mark. Thanks, Robert, also for inviting me today. I think it's important to frame the turbulence, the geopolitical turbulence that we're witnessing now because of the energy boom that we're seeing a little bit broader than we've done so far. It's a global story. So we do have an incredible boom in American natural gas and oil production, but at the same time, we're seeing a big boom in oil production and future oil production in South America, both coasts of Africa. We have huge natural gas finds in the East Mediterranean off of Israel, Kurdistan, Australia, and all things being equal, the reason why the American boom is so important and why it's so consequential is that well, two reasons. One is that all things being equal, it adds these volumes of natural gas and finished refined product onto the global market. But there are added volumes in so many other places too. So what this has done is all of these things taken together is created a lot of moving parts. You've had a situation of 5 years ago or so of we had certain presumptions, assumptions of what geopolitics was, who was powerful, who was not, who was relatively powerful and who was relatively not, all shaken up now because of the U.S. now shoving out onto the global market the natural gas that was assumed it needed. Now that's shoved onto the market, undermining Russia, for example. And then now, because the U.S. is producing so much more oil than it was, that oil that it would have imported, that's shoved out onto the market. That creates a lot of moving parts. We've read a lot the last couple of years, and I believe Ed Morse is going to discuss this this afternoon, and my fellow panelists may also. The obvious winners and losers we've seen, who we read about a lot. Russia, probable loser. OPEC, undermined. So I'm not going to focus on them. I want to focus on places, countries, and regions that aren't thought about much. And I want to drop in one caveat that's very important. In the same way this point was raised on the earlier panel, and that's that linear thinking got us to a place where we were broadsided by the boom that we're seeing now. We should not get caught up in the same fallacy that what we're seeing now is going to go on forever. Either it could, and it may not. And so let's look at what could happen should what we're seeing now continue. The places that I find the most interesting, the new Caspian Sea is East Africa. So the boom that we saw and the changes we saw happen in the former Soviet Union, in the Caucasus and Central Asia, the strip of countries starting in Mozambique and going north all the way to Somalia and Ethiopia. This is the new boom area for oil and natural gas. And those states could see a seismic change, and probably will see a seismic change in their wealth. Whose wealth will matter a lot. Some of those countries will get it right, and some of them will get it terribly wrong. Anadarko and ENI alone plan to spend $50 billion on infrastructures in Mozambique from now till 2020. Israel, 2 big natural gas finds in the East Mediterranean off of Israel. This Israel is again redebating. It's debated, now it's redebating what it's going to do with this natural gas, and what it does will define what the impact is geopolitically. But certainly to Israel, this has great significance. Kurdistan, the conventional wisdom for so many decades was the way that 4 countries that have big Kurdish populations, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Syria, dead set against, viscerally against the creation of a Kurdish region. And now we're seeing just the opposite happen. Iraqi Kurdistan has got a lot of oil. Exxon, Chevron, a lot of other companies are drilling this. They're going to export it. Turkey is reforming politically its area of Kurdistan. Syrian Kurdistan is carving out its its portion. All of these things together, we're seeing the formation before our eyes of a Kurdish state, a quasi-Kurdish state. And finally, China, because of China's appetites, its changing appetites for coal, natural gas, oil, and then public opinion. The way public opinion in China is turning against this pollution that we've seen since January, not being able to see, a few feet before your eyes. China is having to change its diet of hydrocarbon consumption, and what direction it goes will have big geopolitical impact.
Thanks, Steve. Sandy.
Thank you, and thanks again to Mark and the Institute.
Come a little forward, Sandy. There you go.
My perspective on the shale revolution, one thing that hasn't come up so far in the discussions is that really there are kind of two phases to the development of shale in the US. The first one was a massive expansion in the production of natural gas, particularly from the Barnett Shale in Texas. And that gas is what they call dry gas, so it doesn't need much processing. It can be sent to the pipeline relatively easily. And the success of that shale drilling and its expansion into other areas of the country, particularly in the Marcellus, basically led to a massive overproduction of natural gas. And by around 2011, we produced more gas than we needed, and there was demand for. And there was a mild winter in 2011, and in the first quarter of 2012, the price of natural gas plummeted to $2 an MMBTU, which is very low, beneath the cost of most drilling prospects. And at that point, the game could have been over. But actually what happened was that the guys who were doing the drilling and the prospecting figured out that they could move to liquids and start drilling in areas where you didn't just get natural gas, but you also got oil and natural gas liquids. And what had actually happened was that as the price of natural gas had dropped, the price of oil stayed the same. And the reason was that there was no immediate demand for that increased production of natural gas. There was no place to soak it up, so the price fell. Whereas with oil, basically any increase in production in the US is just replacing imports. So it doesn't impact the world price so dramatically. And in fact, because of the congestion that occurred when oil production started to crank up in 2012, it was already congesting the pipelines and causing inland prices of crude oil to go low. So this created two things. First off, the low price of natural gas meant that there needed to be a market for it, because even as producers stopped drilling in the dry gas areas and moving to the liquids, there was still a huge amount of gas getting produced associated with the liquids drilling. So you get gas that comes with those oil wells. So gas production continues to increase, and the price stays low, and oil prices stay high, and the producers are making money by moving into oil and liquids. And the amount of oil the US produces is increasing exponentially, as we've heard. So the first impact of cheap natural gas is that you create cheap energy, and that's the feed that we've heard talked about as far as the renaissance in manufacturing industry in the US. It wasn't about $8 natural gas, it's about $3, $4 natural gas. So that was created kind of as an accident of the first success, the initial success. So remember that the success in this business is all about not overdoing it. Too much production causes prices to fall, and that's the thing that's going to kill the golden goose. But ironically, that low cost of natural gas actually enhanced the value of the liquids, because liquids are, natural gas liquids, as we heard, go to petrochemicals. And so natural gas as the feedstock, the cheap feedstock for those chemicals, means that the US can manufacture petrochemicals at a far lower price and can compete in world markets. Also, excess demand for, or excess production of natural gas has led to the slow implementation of exports of natural gas. And we hear now about the rollout of LNG exports of natural gas, and that over the next few years that's going to be a significant part of the demand for the natural gas the shale revolution is producing. But in the meantime, we've actually been sending a bunch of natural gas to Canada, and we've been sending a huge amount of natural gas to Mexico. And those guys have benefited hugely by cheap energy. Cheap energy drives everything. Mexico is going to have, I would say, in terms of the winners and losers, in the short term, Mexico is probably one of the biggest winners out of this whole deal, if you not counting the US. And that's because they're getting access to low-priced natural gas straight across the border at the same price that people pay in Texas. And they're using that for economic growth, for generating plants and for industrial growth. At the same time, the pressure to export natural gas from the US is now enabling countries which are also reliant on natural gas to start looking forward to lower-priced energy resources. And another big winner then is Japan. Japan, totally reliant on external energy sources. Their internal production of nuclear is shut off for the moment. So either they import massive amounts of oil, massive amounts of coal, or natural gas. Right now, they're paying $14 for their natural gas. The US can produce it at $4, and in 3 or 4 years' time, when those LNG export plants get cranked, Japan's going to be able to take advantage of lower price for their energy. Right now, all the price that they pay for natural gas is determined by an oil formula, an oil price formula, and that will change, and they'll be paying US pricing. So they will benefit from lower prices, and the market, the international market for natural gas, will take a seismic drop in terms of the price that the market's willing to pay. And all of that is derived from the innovation that, first of all, overproduced, but also the fact that here in the US, they can produce natural gas and still make a profit at $4 or $5 an MMBTU versus the rest of the world, where the big losers, you're going to see Australia, Indonesia, where those guys, equally big production of natural gas, huge LNG export facilities, but their pricing point is way higher, and their investments are looking much more risky now. Other losers, Canada. Canada has lost out big time just because, unfortunately for them, they are also a big producer of oil and gas. Their only market is the US, and all of a sudden these upstart independent producers have gone ahead and produced a whole bunch of lower priced oil and gas, which is taking away their market share. And they've had to innovate and develop new ways to get their oil and gas to market. It's not just a Keystone pipeline issue. They need to find new markets because the US is producing its own resource, and so they need to figure out export markets. And again, them putting a huge amount of natural gas into the world's export market continues to keep downward pressure on the international price of natural gas as a resource. And then finally, just briefly, as far as a loser goes, just another perspective from a geopolitical perspective. Think of Iran. Why is Iran all of a sudden trying to come back to the negotiating table? Why are they willing to talk about taking the pressure off them as far as sanctions goes? Well, to me, there's obviously a lot of political issues and reasons around it, but one of the principal forces behind that is that because the US is producing significant amounts of oil, and there's less pressure on the price of oil when one country is taken out of the equation, that basically meant that sanctions against Iran could be effective, and that other countries were willing, the US in particular, and other countries were willing to push harder on sanctions, and as a result of that, they've lost out from their ability to use their oil as a weapon. And that is illustrative of a changing dynamic in the Middle East.
Thanks, Andy. Ian.
Thanks, Mark, and it's great to be here. Thank you. when I think of this question of winners and losers, I'm approaching it from two different angles. One angle is one that I think we've already seen some discussion of so far, which is the displacement of oil and gas otherwise intended for the U.S., the result of greater indigenous American production. But the other aspect is really how well the American success story will translate into other countries. This is a question that is it's been thought about and addressed and looked at and analyzed and written about for a number of years, and there are no easy answers. So let me just address that part first. The question is, we're going to see replication of the American experience elsewhere, and I don't think replication is really a great word. And I think we really need to be thinking about, will we see other countries with these sorts of indigenous resources be able to come up with their own success in extracting, utilizing, selling, exporting these resources? And when you think about the fact that unconventional resources, shale oil and gas, is basically everywhere, in so many places, you have to think about other things. Which countries are the most highly motivated to tackle this and to extract these resources? Which of these countries have appropriate and even attractive regulatory and fiscal regimes? Which of these countries have, let's say, lower above-ground risks than maybe some others? And when you put together, your mental Venn diagram of those countries that, that really fill that intersection, you're not really going to find many, if any, I think, that all meet these criteria at this point. So I'm going to go in a little bit of a different direction and suggest, contrary to some of what you've heard so far, that I think a case can be made for Russia as being a beneficiary in this regard. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Mind you, there are lots of reasons to think that Russia is being undermined and is one of the losers in this scenario. But I think it's really important to consider that a country with the resource base and the location and the incentive, the motivation, the need to tap this resource, I think is something that we really can't ignore, and part of that is engendered by the fact that fire has been lit under the need for the Kremlin to take sufficient measure to encourage this development. But let me just move off of that for a second and get on to, I think, maybe what is a little bit more of the obvious question, which is, okay, who's benefiting from the displacement of this oil and gas? How are things turning out now? Sandy, you mentioned Canada as being one of the losers. I mean, that is, you said basically verbatim what I was going to say here. Here on Ford. No, this is okay. I'm glad we agree. But part of it is that I was thinking about this and just thinking of this really troubling irony, considering that they have this resource. It's an experience very similar to what's going on here in the U.S. and with the oil running into bottlenecks with gas. I mean, I'm not. My optimism about the opportunity for LNG exports from British Columbia is declining week by week. I'm not sure how many of you are following this, but there's some serious issues that are evolving, and of course, piping gas down to the U.S. is not really the it's not really the business it once was. So Canada is, I think, unfortunately on the losing side of this equation right now. But I'm going to disagree on the Mexico angle, because I think Mexico, in a way, the cheap pipeline gas has made them has really developed a problematic situation where there's now, I think, too much unmet demand that can be handled by the existing infrastructure. which is now engendering, very expensive LNG to have to come into the very few terminals that exist, and that is complicated by the fact that Mexico is also apparently, according to the latest EIA report, one of the more resource-rich countries with regard to the unconventional base. And yet, unless or until, and I guess assuming there are going to be some constitutional changes, the ability of Pemex to undertake the sorts of regulatory and fiscal measures necessary to take care of that, I think is troubling. But I think there's reason for optimism in that regard, and that's so I measure my response in that way. So I think that there are some very interesting and perhaps counterintuitive ways to approach these matters, and just going back to the Russia factor for 1 second. I mean that's the, I know a lot's been written, a lot's been said about this, and in terms of pure volumetric displacement of oil and gas, indeed there is very much a case, there is a very strong case to be made for some issues. But let's be honest about the fact that if not for the unconventional success in the U.S., the competitive pressures would not be nearly as strong. It would not have motivated the Kremlin to begin implementing tax incentives to have foreign partners come in and develop the tight oil. And now it's not saying that it's going to be successful. It's not saying that it's going to solve all the problems. But just think of what would have happened if the stasis in Russia among the NOCs had continued sort of along, without any change. Of course, that's what stasis is. Just imagine that scenario, and I think you would, you'd be seeing, possibly a much worse case for them. So there are a number of interesting things going on.
Thanks, Ian. And let me, I have a question that I want to pursue. It's sort of the macro issue. But first, one takeaway I think you would have to have from what you heard just now from my colleagues here is with respect to the trope that was running around for the last 40 years of peak oil. Think about what each gentleman has said. I mean, the issues that you see being driven by the U.S. production, which by itself is a surprise to people, is what does everybody else do with all their oil and gas? It's not, the issues are framed by the fact there's so much oil and gas in the world as a geophysical resource, in a sense. So it's not a question of is there enough oil and gas as a physical resource in the world for the world to use. It's who produces it, who makes money from it. So the peak oil argument I wrote a little while ago was the stake in the heart was put through the peak oil argument when the oil drum closed, because it was a blog that started around the whole peak oil concept, and they finally gave up because they couldn't find enough contributors to predict that we're running out of oil and gas. So that issue's, except for a few cranks who don't understand geology, that's gone. Now, whether or not there's enough oil and gas produced, what matters is price. So the question I want to ask my colleagues here, if you think about what's going on here, so we've heard about the impact on Israel, on East Africa, on Mexico and Canada, on Russia, and it's always sort of this yin and yang issue. It's not clear, right? It's what my takeaway is, I have an opinion on who's a winner or a loser when I look at it, but Mexico's simultaneously a winner and loser. Winner by getting cheap gas, which is great for their economy. They're the easiest place to ship the gas. You could argue that they're sort of a loser because it takes incentives away from its domestic industry to have to accelerate and produce their own gas because they have a lot of shale. And Canada, the same thing. And in a sense, it will stimulate Canadian innovation, let's say, in infrastructure ultimately, because the money will matter. If they stop finding the U.S. as a ready market for their production, they're going to have to figure out how to sell the stuff that makes them so much money. So what this really boils down to, what matters to everybody in business, and to Cal's comment about what his business does, is about the money. As a physicist, I learned a long time ago doing business that what really mattered wasn't the technology, it was the money. What really mattered for every business and for every economy, for every country, it's the money. So the key metric in the oil and gas business is the obvious one, the impact of the U.S. on price. So what I'd like each of you guys to do is just render an opinion and tell me why, tell us all why. As the U.S. continues to do it, let's assume to your point, Steve, I agree that linearity is not a good model for anything in economics and politics, and not even in physics. Linearity is a construct of the human mind. It doesn't exist in reality. But let's assume for at least the near future that the U.S. continues to produce more oil and gas and will start to export and reduce its imports. That seems to be a reasonable assumption given where we are today. We've already done that. Where and how and why does that move world oil prices and world gas prices, the two of them? Because that's what will determine ultimately, in a sense, winners and losers, because you'll invest money in difficult oil fields in East Africa, politically difficult fields, if oil's $150 a barrel. If oil's $40 a barrel, maybe not. I'm picking extremes by way of mild hyperbole, although those aren't crazy numbers. Same for natural gas. Japan doesn't like spending $14 with gas tied to oil prices. If we de-link gas from oil pricing internationally, that has a huge impact. Right? So, where do you think prices probably go on natural gas and oil? And recognizing, of course, that the domestic gas price is now starting to get linked to international price once we start exporting. There's some linkage, obviously. Steve?
Well, on the gas side, I wanted to point out that there's a presumption that U.S. prices, that Henry Hub prices, get transferred abroad to places like Japan where they're paying oil-linked prices 14, 16. They were up to 20 a little while ago. But you need to. That isn't really going to happen. You know, you're going to end up. You have to add all the price of the transportation and the liquefaction and then the degasification. The whole thing. By the time it gets out to Asia, you know, the estimated price is $12. You know, $10 to $12. There's not that much of a difference between what they're paying now. But I do think that gas, oil link will loosen up. And so you'll end up somewhere. There will be more of a global price, and it'll be something like 10 or 12 in the way we're thinking now. On the oil side, this is very, very tricky, and the thinking is all over the place. The smartest analysts on the planet, Ed Morse, when he comes, he's the biggest bull, and his forecast is you end up in a world of $80 average oil starting next year till eternity, and then Barclays goes the other way. Barclays and Bernstein's no, we're in a tight oil supply situation from here to eternity, and it's driven by demand, but it's also political risk and the cost, the capex, what it costs the marginal barrel to produce. We're in an era of $100, north of $100 a barrel. I'm not going to get into that, just to point out that very smart people, the smartest people, disagree fundamentally on where we're headed on oil prices.
Yeah, I agree with that.
You're going to dodge a price number here? We can't.
No. What I think is that cheap energy generates growth, and it's a cycle, and that creates demand. And so the lower the cost of energy is, the more demand will grow, because economies will grow based on that cheap energy. So we're seeing already the benefits of that here in the US. This tremendous increase in manufacturing, refining, processing, based on cheap energy. And for us, even in our the amount we pay in our utility bill every month compared to rest of the first world is low. And they pay more in Europe. They're paying more for energy because of their lack of access to lower priced resources and regulation around it. So I think that provided that production stays at levels which kind of slightly exceed demand, in other words, there's optimism on the production side and they're not shutting down, then there will be a continued pressure downwards on the price. It's certainly not going to go down below $80 a barrel for oil, or perhaps $8 for natural gas. But given that we have a reasonable belief that the extent and size of this shale resource is such that we will continue to be able to exploit it for the foreseeable future, then that will have a very positive impact, and that it's going to be cyclical. There'll be greater demand, lower demand, as always in economics. But generally speaking, it's a good thing, and that it will people will continue to produce as long as there's a market for it, and that should keep the price going down if it's easier to find. All the worries about peak oil was, this is really hard to find now, we can't get this stuff anymore, so there's kind of this fear factor that, oh no, there's not enough energy left, which artificially kind of inflates the price. But if people get an impression that that's not a big deal, then it should be there should be a cap on it.
Speaking to the gas question, it's in a very broad sense. The growth of the resource should theoretically mean greater liquidity all over. This is the very broad thinking, but because of the way gas is, because of the structure of the gas trade across the world, it's more complicated than that. And what we're looking at right now is a situation where the competitive pressures facing expensive projects are becoming somewhat problematic for those that are unable to really inject a certain amount of flexibility into their commercial structures. Because developing gas is expensive, particularly for export as LNG. And I think part of the implication here is that the discovery of resources, the proving up of reserves, and all of that is that's great news. But I think it's an entirely different matter to find a way to ensure that the actual project development is competitive. I think it was Steve, you mentioned what's happening off of East Africa, and and the potential is enormous. But and I've talked to a number of colleagues, and they seem to think that the cost of developing these an LNG project of sufficient scale and size is actually not prohibitive compared to some other higher cost regions. But part of what folks, I think, sometimes we tend to maybe overlook or forget to look at is that when you prove up the resource and you're basically de-risk the below ground, your above ground risks become more pronounced, and so you're not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily flow that that resource is ultimately going to be necessarily competitive, and it's necessarily going to find a market. It needs to, the whole project, the whole value chain needs to be done in a way that considers what your what your customers are willing and able to afford. And in certain countries, we're starting to see in places where there was certain reticence to be able to want to pay particularly high prices for LNG, we're starting to see a lot of unmet demand really starting to become met in more expensive with some more expensive cargoes. And so the gas situation is complicated in this regard. So part of it is understanding the scale of the actual resource, understanding those project costs, understanding your markets, because ultimately the liquidity has already, the growing liquidity has already had this impact in Europe, clearly. It's accelerating this move toward to more competitive European gas market. It's not happening quite as quickly in Asia. And even within Asia, you should be very much, looking very closely at the unmet demand and the pricing regimes in the individual countries to understand how those markets will be attractive. And these are those complicated questions that will ultimately, help determine which resources developed and at what rate.
So, what we are, and I say this with a caveat that it's not a criticism like my colleagues here. What we're seeing here in this equivocation over picking. an outcome in pricing is the same as picking an outcome in winners and losers. It's very different than figuring out whether you should drill a well. If you're in the business and you're a small company with 100 people, you decide whether to drill a well. You can make a decision on relatively, let's say, geopolitically isolated data because your rate of return, your ROI, you're making money in, well, probably some cases months. I mean, you're back to break even. You're making a profit pretty fast. In these bigger issues, big projects, long lead time, multi-billion-dollar projects, LNG trains, you start to think about above ground risk, your geopolitical risk. So let me turn this to a specific domestic issue that impacts the geopolitical global issue on price for us in the United States for natural gas and the debate over LNG export, which continues because, and most people may know my bias here, I'm an export bull. I don't hold to the opinion that the government should have the authority to determine if a company in the United States that manufactures something can export it. We don't do that for semiconductors, and we don't do that for wheat. We don't do that for almost everything except weapons, but we do that for natural gas and oil, crude, which makes absolutely no sense to me. That said, the authority does reside in the DOE to determine whether you're allowed to spend private capital, and sell liquid natural gas to the world. So, and what the debate, as everyone knows, revolves around is a specific domestic question. We will impact the world market, clearly, if we export a lot of natural gas. There are those who argue, Dow Chemical prominent among them, that we shouldn't export it, we should control exports, because the act of exporting will significantly increase the cost of natural gas in the United States, and therefore be detrimental to companies like Dow. So, not that I want you to defend or attack Dow, but where do you sit on this issue? Because it seems to me it devolves both to domestic political issue, as well as significant. If I'm Russia, if I'm an LNG producer in Indonesia, and I'm trying to figure out, I'd want to know the answer to this question: whether the United States will ultimately become a major exporter, and whether the argument that it's bad wins or loses. Bad for the U.S. economy, that is.
Yeah. Well, first I want to say, I mean, it's hard to compare exports. Hydrocarbons are not like semiconductors. One is a manufactured thing, and the other is a natural resource. And because of our history, but also hydrocarbons they're not treated as a cold, passionless thing anywhere in the world. It's an animate object, and it creates passions and emotions. And so natural gas does not trigger the same kind of reaction, emotional reactions as oil. We're going to end up exporting a lot of natural gas. The Obama administration will approve some number, maybe 6 of these, 5 or 6 of the terminals, and then it will stop, and then it'll be up to the next administration to do that. I don't think that Andrew Liveris, the chairman of Dow, is not saying don't export. He's saying let's not export till kingdom come. And by the way, you know, he has holes in his argument because he's not passing along the savings. So it's not, you know, the revolution, the manufacturing revolution. He's getting all the profit. And he's selling his end product at the same price. Right. Oil is a different. I don't see crude oil being exported from the United States because of this emotional issue. However, it's legal to export product. Mm-hmm. So what is the difference? I don't understand why people are upset. You'll just export. In fact, it's more value, right? You added value, you refine, you create product, and then you export that as much as you want and make even more money. Yeah.
But isn't that what Dow wants to do, right? They want to take cheap natural gas and export more expensive ethylene. So, in effect, they're adding value. They're saying you should add value to the raw material. I agree with you on oil. I think it's politically very, very difficult to argue that you should export oil when that potentially increases the price of gas at the pump. I think it's quite hard to find a political party that would get votes for that. We'll see. I mean, if there's a lot of production, clearly all of our experience is kind of like framed by what's happened in the last 40 years. Before 40 years ago, you had an oil market that was essentially a bunch of handshakes and long-term deals, fixed price, flat. Natural gas, for the longest time, LNG prices have been very, very flat. Coal prices have been very stable for long periods of time, and that's enabled the kind of contracting that people want when they make huge investments in LNG export terminals, and it's understandable that they're looking for a fixed price and a good return on their investment. I think you will see innovation primarily because in the case of natural gas, what we're seeing in shale is not just a different way of getting it out of the ground, it's turning it from a kind of potluck drilling expertise to a manufacturing mining type business. So it's then possible to do what's actually happening in these LNG deals, which is to link a piece of land with gas underneath it to the actual consumer, so that they're essentially harvesting a shale area or region in order to provide the gas for the project, so that price is less of a risk in the deal. So you could see that kind of development.
You know, it's interesting. You know, I think we and I know a number of folks have found a lot of qualms with the regulatory procedure. And I suppose that we can nitpick at whether or not the procedure is fair or right, or even whether the guidelines, the established guidelines that the regulators are using to determine approvals. We can even argue whether or not that's we can argue about how valuable that is. But ultimately, what I keep coming back to is the nature of the commercial structure that's evolving in the U.S. With the LNG export model, it's really starting to pop up here, which ultimately is going to the volumes that will ultimately find their way to the market will ultimately be determined by market forces at the end of the day. No matter how many terminals you can handicap which terminals when and whether they'll get built, but ultimately, as long as they are of the commercial structure that's evolving, and you have flexible players involved in tolling gas and being able to use the flexibility of markets, I think that you have again these greater market matters that will ultimately determine volumes, and I think that's in some ways maybe a more interesting question, because depending on your point of view of how you're viewing gas markets over the longer term, will help you start to really think about the notion of the viability of lower 48 LNG exports. So. Other things are going to play a role. Oil prices are going to be a huge issue here in U.S. lower 48 LNG exports, because if oil prices fall to $80, then the drive of the Japanese to want to fixate on getting LNG from the Gulf Coast potentially wanes somewhat. So I think there are many more moving parts, and I think this phrase came up at dinner, and a number of times it's the moving parts aspect that go beyond the regulatory idiosyncrasies that we should be considering.
We're mildly back into the equivocation domain, but I'll take issue with one thing briefly with Steve, and I've discussed this before. We don't want to beat on this issue, but the hydrocarbon business has evolved, in my view, from extractive industry to a quasi-manufacturing industry. And then we have this old debate in the United States about what I would call industrial policy, the extent to which the government should manage outcomes of what industries should export things and who you can sell it to, and or who should be subsidized when subsidies come in terms of tax preferences and the rest. It's an old debate, and I actually agree with Steve. I think it's actually moot for the time being because of the time it takes to build these facilities, and if 6 get built, even if it was no restrictions, odds are good that others will just wait and see how things go for a few years. So it gets punted to the next administration by default, but nonetheless, I have to repeat on the record, I think to me, it's offensive that they have any say in it, but that's just me, because but I agree with the passion of it. This is what's intriguing to me. So we have one of the most passionate commodities on the planet, which is oil, not gas so much, although I think it's getting dragged into it. Let's come back to Iran, because you said something, all of you have touched on this. So the United States has added the equivalent of a few million barrels per day of production to a world that produces nearly 90 million barrels per day. It doesn't seem like a big number, except in the oil markets, as my colleagues well know, and you all probably know, it's the marginal production that really dictates the volatility of the price, how much slack there is in the market. It's true of every commodity, particularly things that have to be essentially produced as you need them. There's only 3-4 months of storage globally of annual demand. So markets are very sensitive to the margin. Adding a new oil producer, as Robert put it, I mean, just the addition in the United States is equivalent to adding a major OPEC country. It seems to me, odds are that others who have said this are right. It's taken a lot of pressure off of the threat of a price spike because of Middle East turmoil, or inversely, taken a weapon away, a political weapon away from Iran. I think that's particularly important right now for obvious reasons, but I'd like each of you to explore it a little deeper in this sense. Do you think that's really true? But more importantly, if the Middle East, and I'll say this with any delight, if it does get worse and blow up, if things degrade and you end up with a fighting war again, we've had a long history of fighting wars in the Middle East. What do you see the impact on two issues? Price. Do you think it really spikes? Is there enough slop in the market now? What happens? So the two issues here are: have we really pushed Iran implicitly into the bargaining table because they don't have a weapon anymore? And without regard to whether it's done maliciously, let's just say there are people who might maliciously want this to happen, but it's just because of incompetence in the normal progress of human affairs, fighting war breaks out. What happens?
Why don't you ask an easy question?
Well, this is if you were advisor to the president, know this is
I'm
only.
Not going to go
and
there,
if you were the advisor to Putin, he would ask you this.
Yeah, but
which would be more fun, probably, by the way.
On the Iran side, Iran that we've taken. It is true that because the United States has these volumes, but also that Saudi Arabia has been pumping more than 10 million barrels a day recently, that these two factors have helped compensate for the million barrels of Iranian oil that's not on the market. But that the Iranian oil is not on the market, this has been part of the spike we're seeing right now. Oil should not be over $100 a barrel right now. So I do think, just to pull back and just frame it a little bit differently, I do think that Iran has been driven to the bargaining table by sanctions, by economics. And a point was raised last night over dinner that was very interesting, that I hadn't thought about before, and that in the same way that the shale event in the United States has caused Russia to rethink how it approaches its policy. It also it could have, and I think it probably has, affected how Khamenei approaches the nuclear question. A fighting war, fighting war always sends prices up. It sends prices up instantly, and then the market assesses, and then it comes back down to some level. I mean, I don't see why that wouldn't happen again that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Sandy?
Yeah, I agree. I think you can't take volatility out of oil prices unless you flood the world with really very low price oil, which isn't possible given the costs of extraction. So I think we're always going to be vulnerable, and we're more vulnerable than we used to be because news travels faster. So it's difficult to take that risk out.
Fair point. Ian?
And, and just echoing what you gentlemen have just said, that's, I just remember, going back to, I guess the Allied invasion of Iraq, 10 years ago, right? A part of the, I think at that point we're really starting to see, and maybe it wasn't at that point, but I remember, very clearly that folks falling over themselves to try and make connections between, the fundamentals and what fundamentals are dictating oil prices to be, and how much of oil prices is due to other, potentially disruptive factors and other, froth, fear factor, whatever you want to call it. And I'd like to think that we've all learned better at this point to take it all in stride. I guess if you make your living, trading oil and otherwise, exposed to that, that might not be so easy. But just like what we're saying is that ultimately, these sorts of unrest, potential disruption, these things are going to cause some volatility, and ultimately, things will calm down again. I think I think this is Ed brought this up at a meeting we had a number of weeks ago. Ed Morris was talking. He asked one of the panelists about the Saudis and using the oil weapon again against Iran at some point in the future. And one thing that really struck me was the notion that how these days the possibility of doing that and the consequences of doing that are much different than perhaps what they were in the 80s, when the notion of flooding the market and collapsing oil prices was there was a different calculus with potentially different impact. So again, in addition to the hope that we've all learned a little bit better about short-term volatility with unrest, I also like to think that we've also, and this goes for the oil-producing countries, like particularly the Saudis, have thought that these sorts of machinations are hopefully thinking about them a little bit differently than they had been previously.
Well, I'd say that the takeaway, at least that I hear, is it's still the same debate, same complexities, same arguments, same worries that we had 40 years ago. What's changed is the United States has become more of a player, not just a consumer, which doesn't change the complexities, it just adds to them, in fact. I want to open up to questions so we don't consume all the time with Mike. Well, there's a question right here. Microphone's coming up. Gentlemen, hang on 1 second.
When you think about fracking here, the last panel addressed a little bit the communication challenge to educate the people in the United States. When you look at Europe, who in theory live under the threat of natural gas shortage because of what Russia might do for their own political purposes, yet they don't seem to be moving forward to exploit their resources, their shale gas resources. Can you explain it? Can you talk about it a bit?
Gentlemen, do you have an opinion on France, for example? And I would say one by way of a quick preamble. I know that from my colleagues, the challenge with shales, I'm sure you heard this from the previous panel, is that there's not just one way to do fracking in general in a single field. You learn the field, but it varies dramatically from field to field. So the change in geology, geophysics, the morphology of the shale. So that the shales in Poland are very different. The shales in China are very different. The shales from the Permian up to the Bakken, and then now we have the Wolfcamp, which is another shale field, and the Monterey is different. So I think that the challenge is that not only do they not have the infrastructure, set aside the political opposition, they don't have the experience. They have the ability. It'll take them. my view, having talked to folks, including I was talking to T. Boone Pickens about this recently at a dinner. He was in China looking at what they're trying to do with their shales. He said, you know, his opinion was they'll get there. Their shale's very different. They don't have the ecosystem to learn. And he said they'll get there. It'll take them, in his view, 20 years. So they'll come on the market, but that's 20 years in political terms is forever. The French are like New Yorkers, I guess. They banned fracking, so New York and France have a lot in common. It's quite remarkable.
And
Yeah, I just wanted to add. I'm sorry. Go.
No, Steve, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to add that it's not quite true that Europe is not going ahead drilling. Exxon, Chevron, other companies are in Hungary, Poland, and Exxon tried and failed. You know, because the shales are very different. It felt that Exxon felt that the gas could not be extracted economically. Chevron is still trying. Smaller companies are trying, but it's similar. It is similar to the United States in the same way. New York and other areas have moratoria on drilling. So Europe does, and I think Europe will get there, but it'll take time. Yeah.
And I was just going to add that on a you know, taking it a little from a broader perspective. You know, I think there are three. You know, basically everywhere else, we're looking at an environment of what I like to call pre-regulation. Okay, and I think part of the there are really three groups of items that are driving regulatory changes in any of these prospective countries. You know, you have you know, the first thing, you know, you have your economic and energy security imperatives. You know, how strong are they? I mean, how desperately do these countries, you know, need to take advantage or feel the need to take advantage of this resource for the variety of gains? Then you have the environmental, you know, the environmental aspect, which is to what extent is there this environmental question with regard to water use, water disposal, all the things that we've talked about earlier. And then the third thing is the political opposition, the strength of the political opposition. Which vested interests are going to get hammered if gas is successfully developed indigenously in any of these places? Are the renewables folks going to get it? Are the coal people going to get it? Which of the vested interests are going to be, you know, hit the hardest? And what you have is basically tensions among these three factors. And for the countries that have the strongest motivation to develop their prospective resources, but the lowest political opposition and the, you know, I guess the least sensitive environmental concern, that right there is, you're just setting the stage for, you know, that's basically the prerequisite for moving forward with coming up with the sorts of attractive regulatory and fiscal regime that's going to get all the rest of these things happening, that's going to develop the infrastructure and the service sector and the expertise and all these other things. And, you know, and so in that regard, we're seeing variations, combinations of these factors all across Europe and, in fact, around the world, from Argentina to China, you know, South Africa, and it's different everywhere. And, yeah.
There's a
You mentioned oil and gas basically are pretty much unsubsidized. Do you, if you took away all the subsidies for the renewables, the wind, solar, and all those government subsidies, including guaranteeing loans for automobile companies that are run on batteries, you took away all subsidies to the other energy, so-called green, environmental friendly, would any of them make it on their own in the marketplace?
Well, this wasn't the subject matter of this panel, but it's relevant to it in the sense of beliefs that by more subsidies we could reduce our demand for oil and natural gas. So I'll answer it with one word. It has two letters in it. It would be no. But it's a longer discussion because some of the technologies are certainly viable globally and will have large market share growth in niche markets. So there's enormous growth from a small base, and particularly in distributed solar photovoltaics. That's the single most exciting thing for off-grid applications globally. But it is a de minimis impact on the world's consumption of coal, for example, and ditto EVs or the consumption of oil. But I hesitate to drag our panel, unless, gentlemen, you want to render an opinion or be offended by my observation. It's no. Well,
Yeah, the only exception is hydro.
right.
And hydro is storage, and storage is the challenge. That's the issue. If you can crack the storage issue, game over. Renewables start to win.
So, as a physicist, I'm going to tell you, you're not going to crack the storage issue anytime soon.
Yeah.
Storing electrons is really hard. You store a lot of them when you have a weapon. I used to be a weapons physicist, so that's how you make weapons. Go ahead.
See if I got it straight what this panel is saying. You're saying that crude oil prices and therefore gasoline in the United States will not be materially changed by the amount of U.S. production that we see going on, and because it's determined by world prices. But on gas, it seems on natural gas, maybe you're saying the same thing. It's just going to take a little bit more time. I have to realize it was only 7 or 8 years ago when natural gas was determined by world prices in the United States. So, do you see that continuing or happening?
I think in the short term we could see quite a big fall in crude prices here in the US because there's an issue of because you can't export crude oil, that there's too much. Once the production exceeds the local demand, then you'll get very big price pressure downwards, and that will follow through into gasoline prices. So I think in the short term, there's quite a good prospect of lower crude oil prices here, and that's because it's disconnected by regulation from the outside world. And it's the same argument as natural gas in reverse, is because it gets connected to the outside world, therefore we are more dependent on the international price.
I mean, with gas, we have an interesting situation where LNG is connecting markets, but not creating a world market. There's no global gas market. It's a very unique situation, and to expect that, I know, like sometimes folks like to throw around the term convergence at some point, that there will be a gas price. And we're chuckling because the question comes up, and you ask 10 people, you get 10 different perhaps equivocations on on the prospects. But let's state fairly definitively that those prospects are not short term. And that, taking it one step further, I'm arguing that the impact of LNG, even Henry Hub priced LNG coming from the Gulf Coast, and the impact outside of the U.S., the impact on the world, is really not set to be something of any great significance. You have some potential for some erosion of traditional pricing structures, and maybe not even erosion of the pricing structure, but changing in the formula of the existing traditional pricing structure in Asia. Now, what does that all mean? It means that you shouldn't necessarily be looking for a cataclysmic change in the way gas is ultimately priced in Asia, but you are seeing something very interesting that could develop into something more as time goes on, as many of the long-term contracts come up for renegotiation, and renewal, et cetera. But that's a longer-term issue, not a short or even medium-term factor.
So related to an earlier question, how close are we to running up against the limits of our refining capacity in North America? And I would assume if that happens, there'll be a fairly dramatic drop in crude prices here, since we can't export the excess crude.
We're still importing, as of last week, 8.3 million barrels a day. So it's going to be a while before production catches up. If you include Canada and you talk about North American production, maybe by 2020 we'll be getting to kind of equilibrium. It's actually a more complex problem because refiners built a lot of refineries on the Gulf Coast to process heavy crude oil, which all of the crude from shale, tight oil, is very light crude oil. And if you put that into a refinery built for heavy crude, it bubbles over the top, basically. And so there are a lot of issues that they're trying to work out in terms of, instead of saying we just ban the export of crude oil, maybe there's some swap arrangements where if we export a certain type of crude and import another, you can net, and it's not such a big political problem. There's definitely some moves occurring to do that, but it will be a while before we hit there.
You danced around Keystone, since implicit in one of the more volatile export-import issues in the United States, Congress that still, as you know, probably all of the panelists do know, the heavy crude that is refined in Gulf Coast refineries is dominantly sourced from Venezuela, and that the Canadian heavy crude was going to replace imports from an unfriendly country, let's say, to imports from a friendlier country. And so, and given a comment I think Ian made earlier that Canada is one of the losers, so this sort of amplifies you can imagine the tension north of the border on this, and the puzzlement. I'm Canadian, so I have some bias here. My roots are being exposed, so to speak. But you can imagine the political puzzlement that Canada thought they were doing America a favor. And there's another question over here.
Hi. My understanding is that Obama has a technology transfer agreement for fracturing and other advanced oil and gas recovery technologies with China. Several questions sort of related to that. Are there other countries involved with that? How eager has China been to take technology through that agreement? And then ecosystem issues aside, isn't China a natural place where they should very aggressively be pursuing shales, just given their appetite as well as totalitarian nature of the government?
So I'll punt this to my panelists, but with one observation. I have asked a number of the technology players in the fracking business, some of the drillers and the seismic companies, whether or not they would be eager to go to China and sell their wares there, because there's eager buyers of services and technology. And the universal reaction was universally the same. It was no interest. There's so much opportunity in the United States that the additional financial, political, social, emotional risk, all the risks associated with China, which is of no interest. Now, there may be some, I don't know, maybe Apache wants to go to China. I mean, as you get scale and the prices are right, go to China, but I think that's a factor. It's not that's in play. Do you have an opinion on this?
Well, what's interesting about China is, we have seen, I think, a number of interesting moves that, that indicate the willingness and, even the necessity to figure out the business and to figure out how it's done. So, obviously we've seen a number of Chinese companies make inroads, the big NOCs specifically, make their inroads into North America, and we've also seen the beginning of a number of big foreign partners make inroads into the China shale space. So there's movement here. However, and I think as many of us have seen from the recent headlines and from what's happening, is that there are two things going on. One is that the targets that Beijing is looking to meet are starting to look even more ambitious than they were when they were issued. But the second thing is we're also wondering if the opening in China to this point has been sufficient. And this, I think, part of this goes to what I had mentioned just a few minutes ago, which is with regard to, potential opposition or other domestic intricacies in terms of fitting the ambition to the local conditions. And and so for all of the ambition and the targets that are perhaps being issued by Beijing, and even we call the necessity, what we're not seeing to this point is, I think the sort of progress that may have been expected. based on the amount of opening that's happened to this point, and that's, I think, indicative of some of the disconnect that we see in Chinese policy. So,
go ahead.
I wanted to add something to that. I see a different thing happening in China, and that's that there is one from the Obama administration. Just adding to your observation, the Obama administration's a major policy from the State Department is to encourage and help China crack the shale puzzle there. It is a different kind of shale, but to turn China into a shale gas producer, this is seen, and I agree with it, that I think that it'll be totally positive achievement of American policy for China to become a big shale gas producer and satisfy its own appetite for gas and build more local demand. In addition to that, big oil is all over this, especially Shell. The major oil companies want to develop Chinese shale. They're trying to develop it. It's very hard. It's a different kind of shale. The obstacles there with water, distance, transportation, all of the things that you've mentioned before are enormous. And they may not overcome them, but they're trying to.
I would make one quick observation. I think China will implement the Smithfield-Ham solution to crack the technology.
Thanks, gentlemen. Thanks for all your insights. Sandy, could you flush out quickly maybe some of your more pessimistic thoughts on Canadian LNG? And then for the whole panel here, any thoughts on what I think is one of the most quickly becoming interesting geopolitical arenas, which is the Arctic? Any thoughts there would be interesting too. So thank you.
Arctic. Yeah. So the question was about Canadian LNG and about the potential for the Arctic. Sure. I have an opinion on the Arctic because I've been close to it, but I'm not going to. Well, go ahead.
So on the first one, Canadian LNG, I think the issue is there's political barriers to building the pipelines, I guess, and that's the investment issue that is, as far as I can tell, the barrier to the development. So until the project builders find a demand that's willing to pay over the longer term to build those pipelines at prices which are acceptable to the investors, that seems to be a stumbling block, and is, I think, will take time to resolve, and it's connected to the issue of whether they should pay a US price or an oil-based price, and the extent to which the cost of those pipeline investments, how long they should be paid off over. So there's a risk element to it. But Canada, that's the only conceivable market for their natural gas, so I think it will happen.
My thoughts on the British Columbia LNG. I mean, this is certainly part of it. I mean, you have one operator who's it's stated outright that they need high oil prices and an oil indexation in order to make the project, particular project work. And it's that sort of, I mean, I don't want to say inflexibility, but I'm going to say inflexibility. The inflexibility in that sort of framework in an increasingly competitive environment where LNG projects are popping up, 20 plus in the lower 48 U.S. and potentially off of East Africa, and you have to think about the deteriorating competitiveness of the projects as they're currently structured. Because you're going to be encountering a number of different issues. You're going to have cost issues, labor issues. You have building pipelines over mountains from northeast BC to the coast. You have First Nations opposition to a variety of issues. You have an increasing footprint issue in the upstream. You have power capacity issues. You have folks taking issue with wanting to fuel fuel these projects with I think BG wants to fuel its LNG plant with gas, and the coastal First Nations are unhappy with the emissions issues. It just and the time is slipping away on these projects, and and I think unless there's some, I'm suggesting that it would be interesting to see more commercial flexibility for folks who want to get into this business up there, as opposed to sticking with the with the status quo. Oh, hey, listen, we have gas up here, and why don't we, send it here to liquefaction, and then we can send it to Asia? Might not be the best solution for everybody in that particular space. As far as the Arctic is concerned, it becomes more interesting to start considering the Arctic and other frontier and less hospitable places, both environmentally and perhaps geopolitically, and we start to ask, what do folks need to head up to the Arctic for if opportunities are really starting to proliferate in more stable areas? Remember, not even 10 years ago, there is this big hoo-ha about, the lack of opportunity for IOCs, lack of access. Where are all these companies going to go? The Middle East isn't open, and Russia's not going to work very well, and we're not talking about that anymore because it's not quite the issue that it once was. So, then it makes sense for us to ask, is there really necessity?
Right, exactly.
And for that matter, we've also started to see companies like Shell and ConocoPhillips encounter some difficulty.
It's a tough environment. It's cold up there.
That's what I've heard.
Well, if you look at Alaska, production in Alaska is declining. It's been declining for the last 10 years, and there's no incentive to invest because U.S. oil companies can drill here, and it's cheaper. To get Alaska to produce in the first place, the U.S. government had to pay for the pipeline. It's a huge cost. Why take the risk?
Steve, do you want to make a closing observation on my cold northern homeland?
Yeah, just something quick. So not on the Arctic really, but on your homeland, on Canada. I think a little bit differently. I don't think Canada is a loser from the shale gale, as Robert's called. I think it's a winner, a law of hydrocarbons, an axiom. The gas can get bottled up. That could happen, but oil almost always gets out. It's not going to be bottled up, and it will be able to sell the bitumen from the oil sands.
That's true. I'm going to have to wrap up. I'm getting this high sign. So thank you all very much.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.